Hello, everyone. We're going to give folks a couple of minutes to get into the Zoom room, but thank you all for joining us today. If you haven't done so already, I'm going to ask you to please mute yourselves for the first part of this event. This will have a panel discussion to start off with, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions after the panel discussion. And just a note to the attendees, we do have transcripts, live transcripts available. It has been enabled, so you can request that. All right, it is 4:02 and I always want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to go ahead and start. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules, what I know to be very busy, to have this conversation. It is one that I am very excited about. I am learning, like all of you, about neurodiversity, and we've got some great experts on the panel. Just a few housekeeping rules for the event to go smoothly. Again, I ask that everyone would mute themselves during the panel discussion, just so we can have less than 30 voices talking at once. But you will be allowed to ask questions after the panel discussion, and you're welcome to drop questions in the chat, and it will be moderated. I will be checking the chat for questions and bringing those to the panel. After the panel discussion, again, we'll have some time for general Q&A, and then each panelist will host a breakout room, and you will be allowed to self-select into the breakout room of your choice. And then we'll do a quick close just to kind of talk about some takeaways. With that, I will introduce myself, the talking head that you hear or see. I am Danielle Crocker. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Assistant Director of Employer Engagement at DePaul University in our Career Center. And I am so excited again to have everyone here. This will probably be the last time you hear from me, but if you do need to communicate, if there are any questions, please do drop it in the chat and I will be paying attention. And with that, I'll hand it over to Greg.
Danielle, thank you so much. I hope that you all can hear me. So the Great Resignation has caused many employers to explore untapped talent pools, such as neurodiverse college students. However, before employers jump in, education and training are needed to ensure equity, inclusivity, and belonging for these talented candidates during the hiring process and after onboarding has ended. The goal of today's discussion is to share best practices, insight, and strategies to help employers recruit and retain neurodiverse college students. My name is Gregory Moorhead, and I'm the Director for the Center for Students with Disabilities at DePaul University. And I'll serve as the moderator for our panel discussion, which will be titled Supporting Neurodiverse Students Throughout the Recruiting Process and Beyond. So let's meet our amazing, talented, and experienced panelists. So what I'm going to do, folks, I'm just going to say your names to kind of help us to flow, and then just spend a minute or two telling us who you are and what you do. So let's start off with Victoria.
Hi, I'm Dr. Victoria Duvet, and I am a clinical psychologist and diversity coordinator at DePaul University's Family and Community Services, and I use the pronouns she, her. My main roles are working with neurodiverse children, adolescents, and families, and we offer therapy and psychological assessment services at our clinic to the communities, and we provide comprehensive reports and recommendations for diagnoses such as autism, ADHD, anxiety, depression, and developmental disabilities. One of my other roles is also supervising graduate students from the DePaul Psych program, some who are often neurodiverse themselves. And we work together to create different plans that would help in terms of accommodations to set them up for success in our training program. And lastly, I coordinate our diversity trainings to all of our staff and students. And with my team, we also reach out to other organizations to focus on topics or make presentations on acknowledging bias or intersectionality in the workplace and increasing awareness, knowledge, and skills working with neurodiversity and decolonizing mental health approaches. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duvet. And so let's go next to Andrew.
Yes, hi, Andrew Eddy from Untapped, dialing in or zooming in from Australia. So it's now Wednesday morning here. So we work with a whole range of companies on creating sustainable employment programs. So we have a proven model which we can implement fairly quickly and then help companies integrate that into business as usual. We also focus on creating a talent pipeline. So we have an initiative called the Neurodiversity Hub, where we've got about 30 universities around the world who are part of that community practice and a large number of employers. And we encourage all universities and employers to become part of that community practice. We also create life skills training materials for neurodivergent individuals. And we've got a whole platform around fundamental cybersecurity training, which can help individuals find out if that's an area of interest for them. But thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And next, Kevin.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Irvine, and my pronouns are he, him. I work at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. My job title is Senior Talent Acquisition Consultant, individuals with disabilities, which reflects my role on our recruitment team, recruiting people with all types of disabilities, apparent and non-apparent, as well as veterans. And I also support our work to recruit people from our local communities on the west side of Chicago. Besides my work on the recruitment team, I co-chair Rush's Americans with Disabilities Act Task Force Committee, which started about 30 years ago. And I also helped launch and I facilitate our Disabilities Employee Resource Group. My background is not in HR or recruitment. My background is as a disability rights advocate and trainer. So my whole career has been working with people with all types of disabilities to help people understand their rights in a variety of areas, including in employment. And this comes from my own personal connection to disability, which is I've got non-apparent disabilities, which are HIV and hemophilia B. My wife and daughter also both have disabilities, and my daughter has some neurodivergent disabilities as well. So that's my personal stake in this, my professional stake, and I'm very excited to be on this panel. It's a great group, and I'm looking forward to connecting with everyone today.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And Ari.
Hi, so grateful for the opportunity. I own a company called Tactful Disruption. We're a digital mental health coaching and consulting practice. We address intersections via leveraging social media and making like theories come to life for creatives or what have you. We embedded ourselves in DBSA, Depression Bipolar Support Alliance, helping those individuals with an identified lived mood experience or some type of neurodivergent tendency navigate the career sector by giving them the professional development training and helping them elevate their distinctiveness and belonging. I'm also a professor at Pepperdine University, where I teach psychotherapies and counseling techniques, and I definitely catch the students who don't know that they may have ADHD or they may be, so trying to keep them in tune with themselves. And I'm in the United States military, so forgive me for showing up like this, y'all. But we do, we make sure that we advocate for military, millennials, and minorities.
Thank you so much, Ari. And next we have Margaret.
Hi, my name is Margaret Mcgee Newton, and I'm the Director of Career Education at DePaul. I've worked in higher ed for 20 years with students with disabilities, generally from the professional development lens. So most of my experience is focused on the student barriers to seeking employment opportunities, the anxieties they bring into our advising conversations, and really the experience of the student who doesn't end up in a recruiting pipeline, because I think that that's what I think employers don't always have access to. So that's something that I care deeply about, particularly at DePaul, where our students have very intersectional identities, and we are trying to connect students to meaningful careers as part of our Vincentian mission. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Margaret. And next we have Tracy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Palberty. I'm Vice President of Corporate Engagement for Integrate Autism Employment Advisors. My background actually is in IT. I ran the Northeast IT organization for what was at the time MCI Telecommunications, now Verizon, before my daughter was actually diagnosed with autism. And then I left the organization and started focusing on her for a period of time, and then went and started working in retained executive search, doing searches at the vice president level and above for companies in the technology space as well, before reading about some program that Integrate was running with at the time PwC, reached out to the president and founder and said, I'd like to help. And now I am fully entrenched and have been here for over a decade helping Integrate, whose mission is to help companies identify, recruit, and retain autistic professionals. And our vision is obviously inclusive competitive employment for those neurodivergent individuals. And in the last about year and a half, we've placed about 75 candidates in positions, full-time contractor roles and internships across the US and Canada. We've trained about 2,000 employees at around 45 or 50 companies. So our goal is to create autism-friendly employers. So thank you, pleasure being here.
Thank you, Tracy. And lastly, we have Megan.
I'm honored to be a part of this discussion and learn from all of you and from employers' needs and be involved in the discussions later. I'm from Inclusively, and we're a relatively new company that started at the start of the pandemic in 2020. We launched on the 30th anniversary of the ADA, and we're a technology solution for people with disabilities, including neurodivergence, chronic medical conditions, mental health conditions, anyone that would benefit from using a platform that is focused on hiring talent or focused on working for, I should say, employers that are focused on hiring talent from among the disability community. So inclusive employers that are really committed to this work and to understanding what it means to have a diverse team. We're a marketplace, basically, where employers come to find talent from among the disability community and to drive employment among a group that's far, people will talk about an untapped talent pool, but plenty of talented individuals that if they can find the best fit for their skills and interests, that's kind of part of what our technology is designed to do. All of our data is from among the disability community and an algorithm that matches employees or candidates, job seekers to jobs for the employers, so they see sort of recommended matches, and that can overcome some of the biases in the hiring process. And then we're also working directly with the employers who sign on to work with us in training and providing different resources, like trying to bring in as many experts as are on the call as well in neurodiversity training, all the resources that could help you to better understand inclusion in the workplace. And then our job seekers come to us always for free, and they are able to choose accommodations. One of the draws that would help them to do their best work. And then we're also educating the employers on how best to provide those. So it's sort of a matching platform in that way to help employers be able to sort through who would be the best fit for the job. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'll expand on those different parts in the questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all. We've got some great questions here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Danielle, I'm going to ask you to keep me true to the time. So if you'll help me to be mindful of the time. The first question I want to pose to Dr. Duvet. We hear the terms neurodiverse and neurodivergent all the time. Can you help us to understand, what those terms actually mean?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the way that I kind of conceptualize it in the psychological and mental health field is that there has been this movement in the past decade or so around neurodiversity that really helps us start to understand that it's both normal and acceptable for all of us to have brains that function differently from one another. So in fact, we are all neurodiverse. We all have unique ways in which our brains function that are different from each other, and we're all wired differently to some degree. So that's how I like to think about neurodiversity. And so this is a social justice movement in my perspective that helps us maybe change the way we think about neurodiversity. So we can start to celebrate sort of these infinite strengths and uniqueness of human brains as a very whole, and start to reduce stigma around learning and thinking differences in order to actually just increase community and belonging and creating more safe space for people to just exist as they are. And so that calls into question, what does neurodivergent mean? And neurodivergent is really just a term that, in my perception, again, helps us understand that people who are neurodivergent typically experience or interact with, maybe interpret the world in ways that are deemed different than what is considered typical or neurotypical. So these differences may manifest potentially in thinking, so cognitive and mental functioning, processing information, learning, and memory in the brain. And so you might see this potentially with individuals meeting developmental milestones at a later date, for instance. So some areas of neurodivergence can include, but not necessarily be limited to autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, and some mood differences that have been mentioned here already in the introductions, things like depression, anxiety, and a lot of other areas. So an important thing that I also wanted to point out is that people who are neurodivergent exhibit brain and processing differences in various ways based on identity factors and lived experiences like gender or sexual orientation, race, culture, socioeconomic status. So it's really important, in my opinion, to consider intersectionality when we're talking about neurodivergence as well. So thank you for that question. And if anyone else would like to add anything, please feel free.
Okay, thank you for helping us to define our terms. I want to start by posing this question to all the panel, and anyone can feel free to respond. What are some of the best practices that employers should implement when recruiting neurodiverse college students? So again, let me repeat that. What are some of the best practices that employers should implement when recruiting neurodiverse college students? And I'm going to see, Megan, are you willing to answer this? I see your light on. I don't want to call on you inappropriately. I just see your light on.
No, that's okay. And I think I forgot to put myself on mute again. So I'm right here.
Okay.
One of the I guess in terms of recruiting, I think one of the ways that we found most interest is going to groups that, like, one of the examples is the Ascend network, or in Palo Alto, like just different community groups where people are plugged in that are looking for shared experiences with each other and examples where they can sort of see themselves represented, I think, and identify with how a certain colleague or someone before them has had a positive experience in the workplace, or some of the different neurodiversity at work programs that have really successful sort of example. Like, I'm thinking of Microsoft as how we got started connecting with their team, but because of the demand for the program and good experiences among the different employees, their model and then the word has sort of spread. So there are different kind of community groups where people will plug in looking for similar programs. So we've been able to recruit or find candidates that are coming to platform looking for work that have found out about us through some of the groups that they're plugged into with fellow neurodiverse job seekers. Also, like it to Paul, I think when there are career counselors or other programs at universities that are focused on serving a neurodiverse student population, tapping into those networks as an employer, or for inclusively as a platform that we're providing to employers, has been a fruitful way for us to be able to recruit and find the students that are interested, find talent that that fits sort of the jobs that we're looking for. That was just what I was going to start off with.
Thank you, Megan. That's very helpful. Any of the rest of our panelists want to chime in on that question?
Yeah, so I was going to say to add, like, train your workers, managers, individuals who may have to come across and don't necessarily have that foundation or background as part of their professional development. But in addition to that, set up a support ecosystem for those students, right? So that could be, if they're doing the online learning, making sure that they have just as much time to be in group learning from their peers for that social learning model to take place. But then, actually working with them one-on-one, making yourself available to them, recognizing that at some point you're going to have to tailor methods to the student because they have, they're differently abled and they need to be able to feel safe enough to give you that information to support them. And a strength-based approach always works with most people.
I'd like to chime in on a really low-hanging practical solution that I think employers could use. I work with a lot of students who are hesitant to apply, even if it says we want diverse candidates. I think incorporating some examples of accommodations that an employer provides, or even building trust with the applicants by saying, as part of our goals around diversity recruiting, we send out all of our interview questions in advance, like just evidence that this is actually what they're trying to do, and the employer is taking steps. So many of my students look at a preferred qualification and consider it required. And it's been, I work with a lot of students who don't apply to these roles that are tagged because the employer hasn't built trust in terms of really putting their money where their mouth is in the actual application process as well.
I can jump in here.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. When I got to Rush about 3.5 years ago, charged with recruiting people with all types of disabilities, the first thing I did was look around and say, okay, so where are all the employees with disabilities now? Rush is a large employer. We have about 14,000 employees. But with most of us with non-apparent disabilities, if we don't have a way of self-identifying or being visible, you don't know we're there, and you kind of may assume we're not there if you're not experienced with disability inclusion. So as I would meet employees with various disabilities, I would get them to, if they were willing, have their photo taken, and then put some photos of employees with a really good cross-section of disabilities in different roles on our external career site to show, not just say, okay, we want a diverse workforce that includes people with disabilities, but to show what that looks like, and show people that, various types of disabilities. When we did that, we also included not just their name and their title and what they did at Rush, but also what their disability is, just to kind of show the diversity of the disability experience. And part of that was to kind of show this culture of inclusion that we have, and hopefully make applicants for jobs at Rush feel comfortable self-identifying if they want to. But also on the internal side, when we go to hiring managers and say, we want to have, we want to be recruiting people with disabilities, we don't want them to think that this is some exotic species off there in the wild. We want them to recognize there are people working for you right now, maybe someone you report to, or someone who reports to you, or who's on your team who has a disability, and also want to really show that disability is incredibly diverse, and it's a broad spectrum, and it affects about 1 in 5 people. I should say about 1 in 5 people may have a disability. And then if you extend that to, we all have friends and family members, people connected to disability is much more likely than not. And so showing it and putting, kind of putting that, raising that visibility so that you can see the face of disability inclusion within employment is really key on the internal side, and then externally, because you want people to feel like, if they do have to disclose for an accommodation for the application process, want to make sure that they trust that this is a place that will respond appropriately. You also have to make sure that the workplace accommodation process is works well for people, because you can't recruit people into a system that's not already working well for the employees that are already there. So obviously, smaller employers, the issues may be a little bit different than with larger employers. But the key thing is, to, show what you're doing and put the message out there. And if you have employees who are willing to share a little bit of their story, that can help a lot just to build trust with people from the outside.
Tracy, I want to let you get in here.
Thanks, Greg. So, I think strategically we see 5 critical success factors in the companies that we work with, like Prudential and Warner Brothers, who've started these programs. First is working with a knowledgeable resource, be that an external partner or somebody internal to the organization. Then having an executive sponsor, you really need to have some sort of executive commitment to the initiative, both in terms of from a resource perspective, funding, and human resource perspective. Then we always say start small and then build to scale, because there are things that you discover along the process that you want to address before you go big. And then really important to have people that are interested and who are volunteering, not voluntelling people. And I think someone else on the panel already mentioned education and training, which is probably the most critical piece in terms of being successful. And then the last factor that we see in terms of success is strong program management. And by that, I mean allocating a resource, be it half a head or a full head count, or somebody within an organization who's responsible for this and accountable for this, and also is responsible for measuring success as well. And so I think strategically, those are the things that we see that facilitate a successful program.
Can I add?
Sure, go ahead, Ari.
I know this seems like obvious, maybe just me. Make sure the person identifies as disabled for whatever their condition is. Like, I am a person with ADHD. I don't see myself as disabled. I just see myself as thinking differently. And if, it doesn't resonate language-wise, that could be the barrier itself sometimes.
Mm-hmm. So important. Thank you so much. Didn't want to cut anyone else off, but we do have a really good question here. I see this come in. And here's the next question I want to pose to the panel. It says, what are some of the critical factors of success for recruiting and supporting neurodiverse candidates throughout the recruiting process and beyond? I know that you've all touched on that before, but it's we want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about what some of those critical factors may be. And so I'm going to throw that out to the entire panel. Let me know if you want to respond. I'm going to look at your boxes to see who lights up first. Andrew?
Yes, so thanks. Yeah, so this is really starting off, I think, with creating awareness within the organization and doing that through, a lunch and learn session to see who's interested in this, getting them involved in these processes. But you've really got to start looking at how you do things and how you're unintentionally excluding people already through the process. It's also important to identify, universities or other organizations you're working with who I see this as something they want to work on, and you can actually partner with them. So you're actually creating that partnership with them. You're looking at the whole process that you go through in terms of the advertisements you put out. In what ways are those advertisements excluding people because of things they're requesting that may not fit with what people think about themselves? You hear the story that if you list 10 items that you're looking for in a job placement, if a man looks at that job, he will, if he can do 3 of the 10, he will apply. If a woman can see 8 of the 10, they will apply. If an autistic person looks at it and they can't, if there's just one thing they can't do, they won't even apply. So you're unintentionally excluding people. So there's those sorts of things to look at. And then in partnering with universities and colleges, when you come to things like employer expos or careers fairs, the idea of working with them to maybe creating a low sensory session within that employer expo. So I've seen universities create the first half hour or first hour as being a low sensory opportunity, because many autistic individuals, neurodivergent individuals can have hypersensitivity to sound or light or whatever. And I've seen universities create those lower sensory things and even put out a sensory heat map about the event so people can see where are the places that they need to avoid, where's the quiet space that they can go if they need to collect their thoughts again. In the Neurodiversity Hub, we've created a resource for students, for universities and for employers about how to have better experiences with those employer expos. So I really encourage doing something internally with awareness and identifying people and looking how you're doing things, and then partnering with universities to try and make that interface a lot better, and looking at opportunities to go and talk to students or create field visits for them to come to the office and job shadow or whatever, create those internships. So there's ways in which you can do things which are maybe not as committed as a whole job, offering a whole job program, but you can start the journey and get people within your organization interested, involved, and start practicing and understanding how to work with neurodivergent individuals. Thank you.
Can I?
Sure.
I would consider the interview process, right? Following up on his point, some neurodivergent individuals might not do well at the first interview, so considering alternative interview styles, and potentially interviews, like maybe that ecosystem of support, group interview styles where there has to be some team relatability piece, but then also maybe having something that allows for their strengths to present themselves as well. And I can speak from the ADHD side. I'm like being creative, being hyper-focused, et cetera, right? But maybe my executive dysfunction is like, I don't turn anything in on time. Not because I don't want to, it's just the thing where time is not of. So making sure you have that conversation about like what type of team they would be placed in, but also letting them know that what they have to contribute is valuable, but recognizing like, do you actually do that within your organization? Or because you have this initiative in place that you're gonna make this exception right now, because that's something that a person wouldn't notice. It's not that they're absence of the social cues or environment, it's more so, how are you going to ensure that they're going to be successful within your organization as they make that transition?
And I can jump in. One other thing, just on a real practical level, is making sure that it's easy for them to find information about how to request disability-related accommodations if they need it for the application or interview process. A designated email account or address, or some easy way that they can find that information so that if they do need to ask for an accommodation, then they know what to do.
I just want to say, as an example, one thing that we have built into our platform for all the employers that we work with is, I started to mention this in the beginning and want to just expand a little bit, but that any individual job seeker or student who's coming to sign up as a candidate for free on Inclusively, part of their profile asks them to choose any what we call success enablers, which would be workplace accommodations. But we like to look at it as tools, assistive technologies, different programs or services or devices or anything that helps them to do their best in the workplace, but including remote work or including on-site job coaching or modified work methods like uninterrupted blocks of time, like however they know that they do their work the best based on the way that they think and function in the workplace, learning to advocate for themselves and be able to select that on their profile, kind of just choosing what the phrase is for that accommodation, but then it sets it up so that when they go into their interview, the employer already knows from having that will come out on their standard Inclusively resume or profile. When the employer then goes into the platform and sees them to set up an interview, it's there as a prompt to be able to ask them about, but we are able to tell our candidates, please, we want you to feel comfortable and feel empowered asking for that, because we are only working with employers that we're training, we're introducing them to what each accommodation actually means, and different examples of people on the job and what that can look like, that most of them are free or very, they're not cost prohibitive, and that these are things that everyone adjusts to, and that overall, if we can learn how to have an inclusive workplace of the different ways that people think and learn and grow together as a team, that's actually going to serve everyone. So most like the employers we're working with are interested in this. They're ready to talk to you about accommodations, and they have listed actually on their jobs, the employers who work with us, which accommodations they already do provide, and then they're open to providing others, prompted by the job seekers or the candidates. And then the other thing I wanted to say was just that in terms of building successful recruiting and throughout the onboarding process, and then sustainably, like having a neurodivergent person on your team or many people on your teams, that part of we're kind of launching this week and into the next month now is a way for the job seekers, the students, the new employees to work with an advocate within our portal, starting from the job search and working on their resume and preparing for interviews, to all the way through the onboarding process and through their career development. But knowing that, and probably a lot of you that are working with neurodiverse individuals know that, and are working on this too, that the more sort of that you can be a support when someone's needing it, to help through any blocks, or to help provide education when somebody needs it. I think just allowing someone who's interested and wants to connect and have that extra support, it's there. But I think Tracy, you mentioned this, and maybe Kevin also, but probably everybody, employee resource groups at companies, like you all mentioned, the sort of different things that you would recommend. And then we found with each of our employers where they've had a lot of success with the students or the job seekers they're interviewing, and that they onboard, if they have a better experience in the workplace, when there is a champion, when there's somebody kind of that's leading a program, that there's a voice kind of from the high up, there's budget towards it, there's employee understanding at all different levels of why this is valuable, and that's really known in the company. I think those are big parts of making the hiring experience successful.
Dr. Duvet.
Thank you. I love everything that's already being said, so I won't reiterate too hard, but I think just to build on it is thinking about the emotional safety of the workplace in general. So what does that look like as a whole? How are you already retaining employees in general? How are you maybe even building community with your employees? How do you make those who work with you feel like they belong? So I think Ari had mentioned earlier something about language. So that might just be checking in and considering the language you're even using, maybe even the events that you're holding, and how you're managing your company. And then also representation. So like, what does your workspace look like? Are you using pronouns, for example, on Zoom? So just thinking about different little things that you can do to kind of show or represent that you're a space that is open and accepting of people existing as they are, I think is an important consideration.
I'm just going to jump in. This is Kevin. One more thing. Well, a few different things that you guys made me think about. It's like if you're having a team meeting, make sure there's captions. There's employees that may need captions that have not self-identified, haven't stepped up. It is much easier to get AI captions now than ever before. Much easier to activate that, even if someone doesn't formally request that as an accommodation. But showing what disability inclusion looks like is really key. A couple of things is setting the tone from leadership. And we've talked about it a little bit, but leaders really need to be challenged to self-disclose if they have a non-apparent disability, because you can't. It's not really fair to expect your employees to step forward and self-disclose and self-identify as having disabilities if people in leadership positions aren't willing to do it. And that is really going to help set the tone. They need to know that disability inclusion is a value that comes from the very top. And I'll give an example. When I got to Rush about 3.5 years ago, we have a diversity leadership council, about 18 people. And I'm looking at this group representing a broad spectrum of diversity around our academic medical center. And I'm thinking, okay, which of these people have a disability? As far as I knew, none of them self-identified. But I know statistically, odds are one of them does, at least, or more. And I was presenting to that group in my first year and was talking about the importance of leaders, self-disclosing disabilities if they can. And in that meeting, one of the members of the council emailed me and said, I have multiple sclerosis. I haven't been that out about it, just to some members of my team, but I'd like to step forward and come out. And so he volunteered. He had his photo added to our careers page. He was in our legal team, and And when we did a little profile of him to promote our Disabilities Employee Resource Group meeting, talking about his role and about having multiple sclerosis, that led to a huge amount of engagement. More people came out of the woodwork to attend our Employee Resource Group meeting, including other people with multiple sclerosis, because they saw him leading by example, and that led to more engagement. And I think that's important internally, and it's important externally as well.
Kevin, I really appreciate that. You're talking about normalizing the process and actually normalizing the identity. That's so key and so critical. We've got another question now that I do want to pose to the group. Can you talk about what are some of the common missteps that you see amongst employers? And I'm going to look for hands there. I think I see Tracy's. Tracy?
So I guess I'll tie in what I was going to say to the last question to this as well. A couple of things. One, the recruiting process is, the interviewing process is in particularly very, very social. And if you look at the data that's out there, and this ties into the overall issue about being aware, which I think is kind of what the underlying issue that people are talking about here, and creating an inclusive environment where people are comfortable disclosing. If you look at the interviewing process, I think it's a full third of managers or interviewers will indicate that they actually make a hiring decision in the first 90 seconds of an interview. 60% of individuals who are interviewing will say that they might not hire somebody because they didn't make eye contact. Another 40% of those individuals will say that they would be inclined not to hire somebody who didn't smile during the interview process, right? So when you think about all of those things, you can understand why the recruiting process, the interview process might be really difficult for our neurodivergent population, certainly for the autistic population. So on the flip side of that, I think goes back to the training and education, is setting appropriate expectations. And that ties also back into misconceptions. In general, what we find, and why we're grateful to the Microsofts of the world who have started to be very, very big and loud about what they're doing. A lot of organizations think that they're only going to find individuals in the STEM fields, that they're IT or they're finance and accounting, and that's it. And in our college population, we all can probably attest to this, that that's maybe about 40% of the population that would identify as being skilled in studying in that space. The other 60% are as diverse as your high school graduating class. So we know that they are very, very diverse as a group. And the other thing I'd want to add to that is that the solution is setting appropriate expectations, right? Which comes back to training, education, and having employers and recruiters know that maybe when they're looking at a resume of somebody who's neurodivergent, it might look a little different. They might have a spotty work history, or they might have no work history because they were singularly focused on their academic success while they were in college. Or they might not make great eye contact during the interview process, or they might answer a question in great detail. All these things are part of creating that awareness and creating an environment where it's inclusive, so an individual will disclose before they walk in the door, or before they get on Zoom and engage in that interview. And so that as you're seeing certain behaviors, you already were expecting them. They're not going to be objections to hiring that person, and they're going to move through the recruiting process regardless of their talent. So hopefully that covered your question a little bit too, Greg.
I did. Thank you, Tracy. Anyone else want to chime in on that question?
Yeah, just I guess I'd encourage employers to look at this from a capability point of view. Where are the areas in their organization that maybe they're lacking, that they have gaps in their capability? Where are they having trouble recruiting people? Where are they having trouble retaining people? And this goes to what Tracy's saying, it's got to be across the board with different jobs, not just IT jobs. So looking across the whole company and not having this as just a diversity inclusion initiative, but having this as a capability or a talent capability activity. I think that's an important take on this. We can't just leave this to people in HR to have this as something that they promote. They've got a lot of other things to deal with different initiatives, and I think it's important to link it into capability. When I have talked to HR individuals, because they've got so many things on, they'll say, okay, well, we might look at that in the future. So we'll come back to that. We might do some sort of program. And I say, that's great, but what are you going to do about the people you already employ? And I think this is something coming back to what Kevin said, is that this is not a choice. You're already employing neurodivergent individuals and they're suffering. So what are we going to do to make this an easier thing for them? These are the people that are crashing and burning and probably leaving the organization. You may not even know that. So what are we going to do around that? And then people then say, okay, well, maybe we should just focus on the individuals that are neurodivergent. And I say, well, terrific, but they're not going to tell you. If you're just operating the way you've always operated, they won't come out and tell you what you need to do. And the thing we've seen make the most difference is a company actually start a program. So they start an employee resource group, or they start an intern program or something. You know, they work with one of the experts on this call and they actually start a program and work with the university to create a program. And that even a small program can make an absolute difference, because the company is putting, you know, time and resource where its mouth is, and they're not just have a policy, they're not just talking about it, they're actually doing something. And that's what I've seen make the biggest difference. Hope that helps.
If I can jump on piggyback on what you said, Andrew, I think, you know, a lot of times people think of, you know, of a disability and accommodation as being something very specialized, and, you know, really, it's all about employee success and giving your employees, all of your employees, the tools that they need to be successful. Do they need a quieter workspace? Whether they self-identify with a disability or a condition or not, what do they need to do their best job? And that's what you should be providing. And so when you're thinking about disability in a very narrow, narrow box, and thinking, okay, well, we have to do something for these people, you're really not thinking holistically about ways that you can help all of your employees be successful and providing them with the tools and support that they need to be successful. When you do think that way, then it's more inclusive for everybody. And then you're really working with people across that broad, diverse spectrum of ability and understanding and work styles.
Yeah, that's right, Kevin. And it goes back to what Megan said about providing examples, because if you just ask someone, what accommodations do you need? They won't know the answer. They may not have worked before. They don't know what to ask for. They don't know what's possible. So the idea of having examples and making those known to people is brilliant. We've got, you know, a research report on the Neurodiversity Hub by a UK organisation that surveyed 400 employers in the UK, and they've come this huge list of accommodations, and some of them don't cost anything, or if you plan ahead, they don't cost anything. So very much encourage that, and we've developed a tool to use with our clients where we're looking at, you know, things like sound, light, sensory, touch, and it's something that you can work with as like a checklist. You can use that with any employee, and I encourage you to use it with every employee, because this should be mainstream. The number of people that I know who would identify as being neurotypical but still don't like open plan because they can't concentrate, this is not just for neurodivergent individuals, this is for everyone. So encourage companies to really make this mainstream in terms of understanding their employees and understanding how they work best and really making that known.
Thank you. Margaret, I think that you have a comment that you want to make here, and then Ari, I'll come to you.
I just wanted to add that we think of targeting centers for students with disabilities as a channel for communicating with this pipeline. And I think that that's a very an easy thing to do, but to also allow for those students who aren't working with traditional university offices and to be ready to have conversations about the intersectionality of an identity. I think that's really important. So Microsoft and EY get all this credit for their neurodiverse recruiting programs. And when I get in and I'm working with a student who's not a software engineer, and we go and we look on LinkedIn to see all the people who made it into these pipelines, they're all from East and West Coast elite schools. And I'm like, this is not diversity. Like, this is, those students, not to say that those students don't deserve those opportunities, but also thinking through what are parts of the communities you're in where you can actually get a more complicated or try a more complicated approach to that diversity recruiting that includes neurodiversity and this other intersectionality. And what you guys are all saying about this menu of options, I think would be really meaningful to those folks who have multiple identities And like we said, those who've disclosed, those who aren't disclosed, those who just have preferences, I feel like treating it more as a holistic thing is going to help people stay successful, and it will earn trust. And that's when I'm working with students, it's all about trust, because they are giving you medical information. That is something that they, like, their entire education has treated this like a prescription in a doctor's office. And that's just such a barrier and a context to start from, that I feel like whatever you can do to build trust through all the storytelling, through labeling your recruiters, and all the ways that you can represent, the authenticity of what you're going to do and how you're going to work with students. And one more thing I'll pitch is for those of you who already are recruiting into those kind of traditional STEM roles, is there a way to move the needle with your employer around recruiting into communications roles, recruiting into social media roles, or other, because we already know there is this channel for STEM, not to say that it's that easy to access, but I'm working with film majors, I'm working with game design majors, I'm working with all kinds of majors in marketing and comm and business, and they all also deserve a chance.
Absolutely. Ari.
Such good stuff. So first things, if you've never read the book Neurotribe by Steve Sieberman, I highly recommend it because it's very insightful. But two, I think one of the things that I've seen across employers is that it's always those names that you know of: Fab, Hewlett Packard, Willis Tower, Ford, et cetera. But you could also look at not-for-profits, government agencies, right? They would have best practices as well. And they would be able to offer insight and maybe even having opportunities to gather more information about what they have done, because there's some level of like looking at like, well, what's not traditional and how have they addressed things that aren't traditional. If you only take the traditional route, you keep making the same mistakes. But if you recognize that there's opportunities to kind of live on the edge a little, you can get more information about maybe some of your own missteps.
Okay. So we've got about, what I'm looking at my clock here, about 3 more minutes before we get into questions and answers. But I do have a few other questions that I do want to get to here. You think time allows, Danielle, for one other question? Okay. So let's look at moving beyond the recruiting process here. I'm going to look at the other set of questions that fall under retention. And I'm going to look at this question here that says here, and some of you have already touched on this with your responses so far, but the question is, what can employers do to raise awareness and increase understanding of neurodiversity?
This is Kevin. I can jump in. I mean, I think it really does. It is so key to just provide a climate where people can share their personal stories and their personal experiences and show what it really looks like in your workplace. Because, if an employee feels comfortable self-disclosing, their disability and the tools that they use in the workplace to be successful, that paves the way for other people as well. And I think that showing, just showing the diversity of the employees that you already have is so key, and helps build that trust. And it really is, one leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. And the more diversity you show, the more diversity you will surface, that's already there. So I think it's raising the visibility. So like when I got to Rush and I'm looking at recruiting people with disabilities and working on disability inclusion, I was trying to figure out how could I make myself more visible, because my disabilities are non-apparent. I'm a cisgendered white heterosexual man, so I kind of I have to actively disclose. And there's a term I love called political disclosure, that was coined by the professor Neera Jain, but it's basically disclosing when you don't have a reason to, like accommodation. So I added my disabilities to my email signature, kind of right below my pronouns, because we're moving into more of an identity focused world, and that's one way that you can kind of put that identity out there, and making however people want to do it, making sure that you have a place where people can feel comfortable sharing their identities is key.
Thank you, Kevin. I see Dr. Duvet has her hand up, I believe. And I believe then Tracy. Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to build more on what Kevin's saying too. I think making it a part of the culture is an incredibly important thing. And so another idea around that would be the trainings and sort of the didactics that are involved moving forward for retention. So making that a part of a culture could look like having some kind of training series based on the timeline that would be right for the organization. So maybe it's once a month, maybe it's every couple months, but making it something that's regular and predictable. And then also eliciting feedback from employees on topics that they would like to see covered as well. And that could be done anonymously too, in order to maybe protect those that don't necessarily want to come forth and share immediately. And another piece of that could be having smaller groups within the organization to process together. So that can be built in as well. So whether it's a group that meets maybe once a month to watch videos or read articles, debrief together. So weaving it in the regular culture apart from larger trainings, I think can be really helpful.
Thank you so much. Tracy?
And I would add to that in terms of, again, starting at the highest level here, it's be intentional. And then it comes right back into the training again, in terms of educating and training and general awareness around neurodiversity, neurodivergent talent. You know, in our training, when we provide it to employers, we talk about the hidden curriculum, you know, those unstated social rules that allow individuals to fit in, that neurotypicals pick right up on. Neurodivergent or autistic individuals, not necessarily the case. Executive function challenges, what do those look like? How do they impact somebody in the workplace? The fact that if you have ADHD and you are and you have an executive function challenge with multitasking, that's not an indication of your native intelligence. It's just an indication of that you're applying that skill in that forum. We talk about theory of mind, and then in all of that we talk about effective management strategies, affecting recruiting techniques, all these things that allow you to be a more strategic and effective communicator as a manager within an organization. And in doing that, you create an environment where somebody's comfortable disclosing and they're willing to disclose. And I will tell you, in every single one of our trainings now, without fail, by the end of the training, we will have an individual who will disclose their disability to the entire audience, just as a result of the company providing the training as well. And I will disclose here, and I don't disclose it at the beginning, but I do typically disclose it during the process. I'm late diagnosed autistic as well. My father was diagnosed at age 80, my daughter at age 11, and then I followed somewhere between all that. So it's, you know, and I'm fortunate. I work for a company where now 50% of us identify that way, and one of our board members does as well. So it's, I work in an environment where it's like, it's actually a benefit. So, you know, you want to create that in every work organization.
Thank you so much. Now what we want to do, we want to open it up to questions from attendees. So I'm going to look and I'm going to ask my friend Danielle to help me to see if we're seeing any hands or any questions from attendees for our panel. I'm going to be sure that we get you folks in here. If you have any questions for our panelists, they will be happy to respond. So you can just unmute yourself. If you have a question now, feel free to go ahead and pose your question.
This is Kevin. While we're waiting for someone to think of a question, I just wanted to share, I put in the chat a link to some, Rush had a couple of different webinars that were instigated by our Disabilities Employee Resource Group. The first one involved employees with invisible disabilities who wanted to just have a presentation about the experience of working at Rush with invisible disabilities. So there were 8 of us that did a presentation that was, we did it over Zoom, and it was, the audience was both internal and external. And then we followed it up with another presentation about mental health awareness and resources at Rush. There's links to the recordings of both of those webinars in the attached document I put in the chat, but also a whole bunch of other links as well. And just to give you some ideas about, you know, ways you can engage employees with all different types of, you know, disabilities and chronic health conditions.
Thank you, Kevin. there's some good information, some good articles in chat. So be sure that you check out some of the information, some of the resources that you see in the chat. I do have a question here that I'm going to pose maybe to Tracy, but maybe to others as well. Can you talk a bit about concepts like hidden curriculum, executive function, and theory of mind as it relates to the candidate experience as well as onboarding?
As I mentioned earlier, when we're doing our training, we talk about in the general awareness portion of what we talk about, we talk about hidden curriculum, which I described, executive functions, and then theory of mind. And theory of mind is that concept of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, the ability to take on another person's perspective. And interestingly, we've kind of switched the training around that now, or at least some of us have. So what we say now is the challenge is not really so much for the autistic individual to put themselves in someone else's shoes as it is for a neurotypical to put themselves in the shoes of a neurodivergent individual or an autistic individual, right? And think about something as your employee would think about it in terms of if you think very concretely, if you think in very black and white ways, in very literal ways. And I'll give you two examples of that. One just happened last week. We have an individual that's gone through the interview process and was told that she'd be hearing in a week. And when a recruiter says you'll be hearing in a week, most of us know from experience or inferential reasoning that probably means 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, perhaps even longer, depending on how that process works. But for somebody who's really literal and concrete, 1 week is 1 week. And when they don't hear, they assume that means you're not interested. And then they also have this experience that's negative as far as their candidate experience. So that's one of the things that we talk about with our clients now is, you mean what you say and say what you mean. And as a culture, that's not how we do things here. We're much more indirect. So that's one aspect of it. We had another individual who was working at an auto parts store on a temp assignment. And we had a global bank offer him an interview, just to go on an interview. He refused to take the interview because he had made a 3-month commitment in a temporary capacity to this auto parts store. Really, really loyal, demonstrated a little bit of that inflexible thinking. But again, in terms of how it can impact the ability to attract the talent and then, retain the talent and ensure that positive candidate experience. These are all things that you want to think about. And they're all things that can be solved by effective and direct communication and then checking for understanding, which I won't go into now, but happy to elaborate in the breakout session. It's one of the key skills for successful managers as well.
Okay, we've got a question. Thank you, Tracy, from the audience. And it's this: you mentioned best practices with NGOs and government agencies. Can you give an example of an agency using best practices? That's for anyone.
One thing I'll say on behalf of government, I don't know that their recruiting process is best practices, but they do a good job of labeling positions. Truly just this most simple thing of labeling job fairs for folks who are disabled or veterans. Like they use those keywords. Now, like one thing I've observed is, at the end of every job posting, you've got your EEOE statement. Most of the students I work with can't tell the difference between that and someone who authentically is trying to create a pipeline. And so government makes it really clear, this is an event for students with disabilities. This is an event for veterans. These are people who have priorities. The user experience of government application, I don't think is wildly inclusive in terms of the way for resumes to be formatted, but they do a good job of making it clear which positions are which through labeling. And that's something I don't see employers doing really consistently, like on Handshake, our careers platform. I've never seen anyone label a role with disability or diversity recruiting. So that's just my experience of helping students navigate government roles, is that they do a good job of those labels.
Being,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, being in the military, especially in the reserves, it's kind of embedded in the overall approach to how you do things, right? Standard operating procedures, tasks, standard, terminal learning objective, right? You repeat that enough for a person to get it, right? So I do take a non-stimulant med, but if planning or being time oriented is one of my challenges, and recognizing that there is a deadline for this, there's planning for this, but I am not alone doing that. I have a team. So I have a support of people, but also recognizing, like, at what level am I at? Who do I go to for the next level? And recognizing that there's a system in place and how I fit into that system. And then taking that lived professional experience and taking it to other realms of reality, which are actually helpful to some degrees. And then if it's a not-for-profit, recognizing that they may have certain language they may use, but if they have a veteran hiring, recruiting focus, and or et cetera, recognizing, like, bringing that language from that world that they served in to help bring them into their organization is going to give them the candidates that are willing to I mean, if they come from the military, they are willing to communicate. So having organizations also recognize that too, that just being in that culture too means that they're going to present differently with information and how they communicate it, and based on whatever their experience was, if they deployed, if they haven't deployed, how they're going to speak to things, how that has affected them and or changed them, or given them an opportunity to recognize there's something going on with them and how they've had to address that.
Thank you, Ari. I think we got just a few more minutes before we go to the breakouts. I've got a question here, and it's, can anyone provide some examples of direct interview questions that can be helpful when interviewing neurodiverse college students? I know that's a tough one. Tracy, I see your light on.
Yeah. You know, there are 5 types of interview questions that we typically see being asked by companies. It's the credentials and experience, the opinions, behavioral, and then what we refer to as the silly questions. One of the things, our individuals can answer the credentials and experience questions without any issue, right? What's your GPA? Tell me about your experience. When you talk about opinion questions, that can become a little challenging, because if you're asking them about somebody else's opinion, that taps into the hidden curriculum, it taps into theory of mind challenges that for some individuals they might struggle with. So you could ask them about their own opinion. But if you ask somebody, if I were to ask your boss, what would they tell me were your strengths? They might say, well, you'd have to ask them. As opposed to, if you ask them that question worded differently, what would you think your boss would say your strengths are? Different question. They can answer that question. The other thing we talk about is, in terms of those behavioral interview questions, we tend to recommend staying away from things like, imagine a time when. Because again, that's this putting yourself in a whole different situation that you may not have any experience based upon formulating a response. And then in terms of the silly questions, or actually, let me talk about one other thing. Nesting questions, like a question within a question within a question, can be really, really difficult for somebody, particularly if it's got working memory issues, which we sometimes see in ADHD, as well as autism. Or be careful with your language. So don't use subjectional terms like normal or substantial, or these terms can mean different things to different people. So when you're asking somebody a question about their ability to focus on quality or their attention to detail, and they say to you, I struggle with that for some reason. We had an individual who said that was a thing they were trying to improve upon, but they couldn't elaborate further. And they actually were turned away because that was a critical piece of the position. If the recruiter had said to them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate yourself in terms of quality control? This individual would have given themselves a 9, right? But because they're concrete and literal, they're saying it's a weakness. They're not at a 10. but the recruiter didn't ask the question that way. So when it comes to asking the questions, you want to ask them in a really specific, direct way that will facilitate success. And if I can do a shameless plug, which I was told I could, so I'm going to do it. We just published, this is our latest book, The Neurodivergent Job Candidate. So in here, we talk a lot about the interview questions as well. So, and give you suggestions for how to word your questions so that you don't run into those issues. So thank you for letting me do that.
This is Kevin. I did want to jump in real quick on that that topic, just because I think I just want to caution not to think that you need to have like a certain set of questions for some candidates that's different from other candidates. I think what I would love to see is, applying the concept of universal design to all of your practices, in that you apply practices that work with all types of candidates and a diversity of candidates, and not worry about thinking, okay, if I know that they have one disability or another, or this condition or another, that I have to do this differently or that differently. So I think if you are culturally competent and you're sensitive to the the biases that we all have around disability and neurodiversity, I think that you're going to hopefully have questions that are going to work for all your candidates.
Ari, did you have a comment that you were going to make?
Yeah, my favorite question is, what lights you up? I do think that if you have the creatives, they're going to tell you what lights them up. They're going to give you additional information that maybe some of your other questions would not have provided. In addition to that, not everyone is engaged in that turn-taking sequence. Not all neurodivergent people are concrete to the, if you ask A, I'll say B. You have some who do go down the rabbit hole. So, having to make sure that you have some boundaries in place with them, because that'll also tell you kind of how they'll approach a lot of tasks.
Thank you so much. This is great discussion. Obviously, we could go on, and we will go on, but we're going to stop now. And I think we're going to go into some breakout rooms. And I think that my friend Danielle is going to help to facilitate that process of what that looks like. But first, I want to thank all the panelists for sharing your wisdom and expertise. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.